This is my true story. I never thought I'd see the day when my own son would treat me worse than a stranger on the street. After all the years I worked, all the nights I starved just to feed him, all the sacrifices I made so he could have comfort, I believed my old age would be met with respect. But instead, he pulled his car over on the highway, dragged me out, and left me in the dark, like trash. But what I did next shocked everyone. Before I tell you, comment where you're watching from and subscribe now. My whole life was built on sacrifice. I did not grow up with wealth or privilege, and nothing I owned was ever handed to me. I worked with my hands, my back, and my sweat. I labored in fields under the hot sun. I worked in factories where the noise never stopped, and I carried loads heavier than my body could bear just to put food on the table. There were days when my muscles ached so badly I could not stand, but I still went back to work because I had one reason to keep going: my son. He was the light of my life, the purpose behind every bruise and scar. I thought to myself, if I suffer today, he will live easier tomorrow. When he was little, I remember carrying him on my shoulders through the rain so his feet would not touch the mud. I would walk miles to buy him a piece of bread when I barely had enough for myself. At night, I would go hungry just so he could eat until his stomach was full. When winter came, I gave him my coat and braved the cold so his small body could stay warm. Every father makes sacrifices, but mine cut deeper because I truly believed he would remember them one day, that he would stand by me when my body grew weak. As he grew older, the sacrifices did not stop. They only became heavier. When he needed school fees, I worked extra shifts. When he wanted books, I bought them, even if it meant I had to patch my own shoes for another year. When he dreamed of going to college, I sold the small piece of land I had inherited from my father just so he could pay tuition. It broke my heart to let go of that land, but I told myself his future was worth more than my pride. When he became a man, his needs turned into debts. He borrowed money he could not repay, and when collectors came knocking, I was the one who emptied my savings to protect him. When he wanted a car, I co-signed the papers and paid the balance when he fell behind. The very car that later became the tool of my humiliation was bought with my labor, my signature, my sacrifice. Even his house, the roof he mocked me under, was built with my money. I thought giving him that stability would ensure he never had to worry. Instead, it only fed his arrogance. Still, through it all, I believed my reward would come. I dreamed of my old age being filled with dignity, of sitting in peace, of hearing him say, "Father, you worked so hard for me. Rest now. I'll take care of you." That was the picture I carried in my heart through all those years of storms and hunger. I thought I had earned that respect, not as a gift, but as the rightful return for all I gave. I never imagined the child I carried on my shoulders would one day drag me out of his car and throw me on the highway like I was nothing. I never imagined the boy I starved for would one day spit words that cut deeper than any hunger ever could. Looking back, I see how blind I was, how much I ignored the signs, how much I trusted in love that was not returned. But before that betrayal crushed me, before that night on the highway broke my body, I was a father who sacrificed everything, and that sacrifice was real, even if his gratitude was not. Cruelty never arrives all at once. It comes in whispers, in small cracks that you try to ignore because you don't want to believe the person you love is turning against you. The first time I noticed it was not in a slap or a shove, but in his words. He began to sigh whenever I asked him for something simple, like a ride to the doctor or help lifting a heavy box. The sigh carried more weight than the act itself. It was the sigh of a man who thought I was nothing but a burden. I tried to laugh it off, to tell myself he was just tired, but deep down, the sigh stayed with me. Then came the sharp remarks, said half as jokes but dripping with poison. "You're too slow, old man. Can't you eat without spilling? You should be grateful you're still living under my roof." Each word stung, but I swallowed them because I did not want to fight with my own son. I told myself he was stressed, that maybe his work was hard, that maybe one day he would realize how much those words hurt. I kept silent, thinking silence was safer than confrontation. But silence is dangerous. It lets cruelty grow. Soon, his patience turned into scorn. He began to mock the way my hands shook when I held a cup. He would roll his eyes when I asked him to repeat himself, as if my ears failing was a sin. At dinner he would snap, "Hurry up, I don't have all day," as if I were a child who needed scolding. The respect that should have deepened with time instead withered like leaves in winter. I started to notice how he avoided me when guests were around. He did not want his friends or his wife to see me sitting in the corner. He treated me like I was an embarrassment, like I had grown into some ugly shadow of his life that he wished he could erase. I caught him once, whispering to his wife that I was dead weight. That phrase cut deep, because it was the same phrase people used for animals no longer useful. He had forgotten I was his father, the man who had carried him when he was helpless, the man who had starved for him. In his eyes, I had become nothing but a weight dragging him down. The small requests I once made with trust became reasons for arguments. "Can you take me to the pharmacy?" turned into him snapping, "Why can't you do it yourself?" "Can you help me fix the fence?" became, "I'm not your servant." I felt the air between us changing, becoming colder with each passing day. Gratitude had turned into resentment, and love had turned into irritation. I tried to remind him of the past, telling him stories of how I had worked to raise him, but he brushed them aside with rolled eyes, saying, Yeah, I've heard that story before." The cruelest part of all was not his words, but his eyes. The way he looked at me as if I was nothing. That look carried a truth harsher than any insult. It told me he no longer saw me as his father. He saw me as an inconvenience, something to be endured until I was gone. And still, even with all those signs, I kept hoping. I told myself, he's my son. He'll come around. One day he'll remember who I am and what I did for him. But cruelty, once it starts, only grows bolder. The small sighs became insults, the insults became shouts, and the shouts soon turned into actions that no father should ever face from his own child. The night he pulled that car to the side of the highway did not come out of nowhere. It was built on years of disrespect, years of scorn, years of me staying silent. If I had seen those first signs for what they really were, maybe I would have prepared myself. Instead, I was blind, and my blindness cost me my dignity. The night it happened still burns in my memory, like an open wound that never closes. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. He told me to get in the car, said he needed to drive somewhere and that I should come along. For a brief moment my heart felt light. It reminded me of the times long ago when we would take drives together, just the two of us. Back then, he was a little boy sitting beside me, and I was the strong father steering the wheel. I thought maybe, just maybe, this drive would be a chance to reconnect. But I was wrong. So very wrong. The silence inside that car was heavier than any words. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched tight, not once glancing my way. I tried to speak, to break the cold air between us. I said, "Son, do you remember when I taught you how to drive on this very highway? You were nervous, but I told you not to be afraid, that I was right there beside you." He didn't answer. His hands tightened on the wheel, and the car sped faster. The memory that filled me with pride seemed to fill him with anger. Suddenly, without warning, he swerved the car toward the shoulder of the road. The tires screeched, gravel flew up, and the vehicle shook as he slammed on the brakes. I clutched the seat, my old hands trembling. My heart pounded in my chest. For a moment, I thought something was wrong with the car, that maybe it had broken down. But then I saw his face, cold, hard, empty of love. He turned to me, and in that instant, I knew. This was not about the car. This was about me. "Get out," he spat. His voice was low, almost growled, filled with venom I never thought I'd hear from my own blood. I stared at him, confused, hoping I misheard. "Son?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "It's late." Where would I go? But he didn't care. He reached across, grabbed my frail arm, and yanked me toward the door. My shoulders screamed in pain, my bones too old to resist his strength. I begged him to stop, but he shoved harder, his grip tightening until I thought my arm would snap. The door flew open, and the cold night air rushed in. Headlights from speeding cars cut across my face as horns blared. He shoved me out like garbage, and my body hit the gravel with a force that rattled my bones. My knees scraped raw against the asphalt, my palms bleeding as I tried to catch myself. Pain shot through me, but worse than the pain was the shame. I looked up from the ground, my son towering above me in the driver's seat. His eyes showed no pity, no hesitation, just disgust. "Walk home, old man," he sneered. "You're nothing to me." And then, before I could speak another word, he slammed the door shut. The car roared back to life, tires spinning against the gravel, and in seconds, the red glow of his taillights disappeared into the night. I was left behind, broken and alone, standing on the edge of the highway as trucks thundered past. The cold air bit at my skin, and every passing car's wind felt like a slap. My body ached, but my soul ached more. I stood there on the side of the road, looking at the endless stretch of asphalt, and all I could think about was the years I spent working so he could have that car, that life, that roof over his head. My sweat, my blood, my sacrifice. And this was the reward. To be tossed aside like I was nothing more than a piece of trash clogging his road. I tried to take a step, but my legs trembled. I nearly collapsed back to the ground. Each car that sped by seemed to mock me, reminding me how invisible I was. No one stopped. No one cared. I was just another old man struggling in the dark, discarded by the very person who should have protected me. My hands were bleeding, my clothes torn, but the real wound was deeper, carved into my heart. I remembered when he was small, when storms would rage and thunder would shake the house. He would run to me, frightened, and I would carry him on my shoulders, whispering that I would never let the world hurt him. I remembered when he was sick with fever, and I sat by his bed all night, pressing cool cloths to his head, praying to God to let him live. And now that same boy, grown into a man, had dragged me out of his car and thrown me into the very world I once shielded him from. Standing there in the dark, I felt humiliation like never before. My lips trembled, not from the cold, but from grief. My tears fell silently, mixing with the dirt on my face. I had been betrayed, disrespected, and abandoned. But as I looked down at my bleeding hands and then up at the empty road, something inside me began to change. The humiliation started to harden into something else, something sharper, something stronger. That night on the highway, my son thought he had broken me. But what he really did was awaken a fire that he never saw coming. Silence has a weight of its own. That night, standing on the side of the highway, I felt it pressing down on me heavier than any stone. The roar of engines, the flash of headlights, the wind from trucks rushing past. They all surrounded me, but none of it mattered, because inside my chest, there was only silence. It was the silence of betrayal, the silence of realizing the person you gave everything to had stripped you of your dignity in front of the world and left you to shiver on the roadside like a stray dog. I bent down slowly, my knees shaking, trying to catch my breath. My palms stung with every movement, gravel still lodged deep in the skin. My clothes clung to me with sweat and dirt. I must have looked pitiful. An old man hunched in the dark, bleeding, waiting for someone to care. But no one stopped. Cars flew by, their headlights slicing across my body for a second before fading into the night. To them, I was invisible. To my son, I was worthless. And in that moment, I almost believed it myself. I sat on the edge of the road, my legs refusing to carry me. The ground was cold and rough, but I didn't care. I stared out at the endless stretch of highway and thought about all the years I had carried him, so he would never stumble. I thought about the long nights I worked 2 jobs so he could go to school without worry. I thought about the times I skipped meals so he could eat more. And now, that same son had tossed me onto the very ground I once shielded him from. The memories cut like knives because they showed me how far we had fallen, from love to hatred, from gratitude to humiliation. The tears came quietly. They weren't loud sobs, just streams that burned down my cheeks, mixing with the blood from the cuts on my face. I wiped them with trembling hands, but they kept coming because pain like that cannot be held in. It wasn't just the act of being thrown out of a car, it was the meaning behind it. He didn't just abandon me, he declared to me, to himself, and to the world that I was nothing. A man who once worked himself half to death to build a family had been reduced to a burden not worth carrying a mile further. I remembered when he was a child, maybe 5 or 6, and we were walking home during a storm. The rain was pouring, the wind was fierce, and he was shivering in my arms. My back ached from carrying him, but I never set him down. I told him, "You'll never walk in the rain as long as I'm here." That promise was sacred to me. That promise defined my life. But now, years later, he had dragged me out of his car and forced me to walk a road alone in the dark. My promise was broken, but not by me, by him. As I tell you this story, I don't know how much time I have left in this world before I go back to my God. And I've seen it with my own eyes. When strength fades, respect disappears. One stumble, one fall, and suddenly they call you weak, a burden. That's why I made the Balance and Fall Prevention Guide for seniors. It's not fitness, it's protection. Just 10 minutes a day to stay steady, stay safe, and keep your independence. Download it now. The link is right below in the description. The humiliation was worse than the pain in my body. Every car that sped by seemed like another witness to my shame. I imagined drivers looking at me, thinking, "There goes a man who doesn't belong anywhere." I imagined them whispering to themselves, "His own family must not want him." That thought crushed me more than the gravel against my skin. Because they would be right. My own blood had cast me aside. The one who should have protected my name had dragged it through the dirt instead. I pulled myself up slowly, each step sending a wave of ache through my body. I walked along the shoulder of the highway, the world buzzing past me, while I limped through the dark like a ghost. My shadow stretched thin under the streetlights, reminding me of what I had become, not a father, not a man of respect, but just another old figure forgotten by time. Every breath I took felt heavy, not just with age, but with humiliation. When I finally reached a bus stop miles down the road, I sat on the bench and stared at my reflection in the glass. My face was swollen, streaked with dirt and blood, and my eyes looked hollow, like a man who had already died inside. I thought, is this really me? Is this what I've been reduced to? And the answer was yes. My son had made sure of it. He wanted me broken. He wanted me humiliated. He wanted me erased. But humiliation has two sides. It can crush a man into nothing, or it can forge him into something stronger. And as I sat there, broken and bleeding, I realized something important. My son thought he had taken everything from me by throwing me out of that car. But he had forgotten one truth. The man he called worthless still held the power to destroy him. The deeds, the accounts, the property, they were still in my name. The silence that crushed me that night began to shift. It turned from grief into something harder, sharper, and more dangerous. I looked up at the highway again, watching the cars disappear into the horizon, and I swore to myself, the same way I once swore to carry him through the rain, that I would not die in shame. I would rise from this humiliation, and when I did, my revenge would be so complete that he would remember forever what it meant to betray the man who gave him everything. My son thought that night on the highway ended me. He thought by shoving me into the dirt and driving away, he had stripped me of the last piece of dignity I had left. In his mind, I was nothing more than a weak old man with no place in the world, too frail to stand up for himself, too poor to matter, too broken to fight back. But what he forgot, what he never understood, is that power does not always sit in youth or strength. Sometimes true power sits quietly in the hands of the one who built everything in the first place. And though my body was bruised and bleeding, I still held the keys to his world. Every paper that mattered still had my name on it. The house he lived in, the roof he mocked me under, the walls he treated as his own, was legally mine. The deed sat in my drawer, signed by me, untouched by him. The accounts he thought he controlled were joint accounts, and every dollar in them existed because I worked myself into the ground for decades. Even the car he pushed me out of, the very car that sped away into the night leaving me on the roadside, had once been bought with my sweat and sacrifice. He drove it as if he owned it, but the truth was, he owned nothing. He forgot that the old man he called worthless was still the one who built the ground he stood on. Limping back home the next morning, I opened the drawer where I kept my papers. My hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore, from a rising fire inside me. The property deed, the account statements, the titles, all of it was there, signed in my name, reminders of who truly held control. As I looked at those documents, my humiliation from the night before began to harden into something else. A weapon. My son thought he had thrown me away, but all he had really done was remind me of what was still mine to take. I remembered the day I signed for that house. It was years ago, when my back was still strong enough to lift heavy beams, when my hands were still calloused from swinging hammers. I wanted a home where my family could grow, a place where my children would never feel cold or hungry. I worked every overtime shift offered, saved every cent, skipped meals, and wore the same clothes for years so that I could afford that down payment. That house was my pride, the proof of my sacrifice. And now, the same boy who grew up safe within those walls had the audacity to throw me onto a highway as if I were trash. He forgot who built those walls. He forgot whose name was on the deed. I thought back to all the times I had saved him from drowning in his own mistakes. When he couldn't pay his bills, I gave him money. When he lost his job, I covered his rent. When he fell into debt, I pulled him out with my savings. Each time I told myself, he's my son. I can't let him fall. And each time he grew bolder, more arrogant, more blind to the truth that without me, he had nothing. I had been his safety net his entire life, but he mistook that net for weakness. He mistook kindness for dependence. He mistook love for obligation. And now he believed he could discard me, forgetting entirely that his life still rested in my hands. I stood in front of the mirror, the bruises on my face still dark, the scratches on my palms still raw, and I spoke out loud to myself. He thinks I am powerless. But the power he takes for granted is still mine. My reflection looked back at me, older, weaker, but burning with something new. Revenge was no longer a thought. It was a plan forming in the silence of my humiliation. He thought strength came from muscle, from youth, from the ability to shove his old father into the dirt. But real strength, the kind he could never understand, came from endurance, from decades of labor, from every dollar earned honestly, from every sacrifice made in silence. I had lived through storms, hunger, and endless days of pain, and I had still built a life for him. That was strength. And now, that same strength would be the knife I used to cut away his arrogance. The truth is, he needed me more than I ever needed him. Without me, he had no roof. Without me, he had no accounts. Without me, he had no legacy. He thought he had buried me in humiliation, but all he had done was dig a pit for himself. Because I was still alive, I was still standing, and I still had the one thing he could never take from me. Control over everything he thought was his. That night on the highway could have been the end of me. It could have been the moment I gave up and accepted that my life was over. But instead, it became the turning point. It became the spark that lit a fire inside me. He forgot that the man he left bleeding on the asphalt was still his father. And he forgot that fathers do not just give life. They can also take back everything they have given. I gathered the papers into a neat stack and placed them in a folder. My hands steadied as I closed it, the weight of it solid in my grasp. That folder was no longer just papers. It was my weapon. My son had used his hands to throw me out of a car, but I would use my pen to throw him out of his life. He thought the highway was the end of the road for me. But what he didn't know was that it was only the beginning of his downfall. That night, as I sat in the dim light of my room with the folder of deeds and documents in front of me, something inside me shifted. My body still ached from the gravel of the highway. My ribs hurt each time I drew in a breath, and the bruises on my face stung with every brush of air. But the pain no longer weakened me. It sharpened me. For the first time in years, my mind felt clear, focused, and alive. My humiliation had burned away every trace of hesitation, and in its place stood a cold, unshakable resolve. My son thought the highway was the end of me, but he was wrong. It was the beginning of him learning who I truly was, not the weak man he believed, but the father who still held the power to take everything from him. I replayed the moment over and over. The screech of the car pulling to the shoulder, the slam of the door, the shove that sent me stumbling into the dirt. His words still echoed in my ears. "Walk home, old man. You're nothing to me, nothing." After decades of sacrifice, that was what I had become in his eyes, nothing. But those words did not destroy me. They became fuel. Because I knew something he had forgotten. Nothing can become everything when silence is sharpened into revenge. And my silence was about to become the loudest lesson he would ever learn. I stared at the folder, at the papers that bore my name, and I made a decision that I had never thought I would make in my lifetime. I decided my son would not just feel guilt. He would feel ruin. He would taste the emptiness he tried to feed me when he threw me onto that highway. He would understand what it meant to have the ground pulled out from under him, the roof snatched from above his head, the life he thought untouchable erased in a single stroke of my pen. That night I promised myself, I would not lift a hand in anger. I would not scream or shout or fight. I would do something far worse. I would leave him with nothing. I had spent years believing forgiveness was the path, that if I endured his insults and his coldness, perhaps one day he would see the truth of all I had done for him. I had prayed silently, hoping for his heart to soften. But the highway changed everything. That shove broke more than skin and bone. It broke the illusion that love still lived in him. If love was gone, then so was mercy. My decision was simple. If he believed I was worthless, then he did not deserve the worth of everything I had given him. I thought of the house, the very house that had been built on my sacrifice. Every brick was placed because I worked until my hands bled. Every nail hammered because I chose my family's comfort over my own. He walked those halls as if they belonged to him, but they never did. They belonged to me. And now, they would belong to someone else, a stranger, anyone but him. Selling it would not just be about money. It would be about erasing his arrogance, stripping him of the illusion that he was master of anything. I thought of the accounts, the savings I had built over decades, the pensions, the investments. He had grown so used to the comfort of knowing there was always a safety net, always something to catch him when he stumbled. But I had grown tired of saving a man who no longer saw me as a father, only as a wallet. Those accounts would be emptied. Every dollar would vanish from his reach. He would learn, in the harshest way possible, that comfort is not a birthright, it is earned. And he had earned nothing but shame. My decision was not born in haste. It was not the fire of anger alone. It was the calm calculation of a man who had given everything and received only betrayal in return. I was not just a father anymore. I was a judge. And in the court of my life, my verdict was final. He would pay for what he did. He would pay not with bruises, not with blood, but with the one thing he valued most, his life of ease, his material pride, his false sense of superiority. As the night grew colder, I closed the folder and placed it on the table beside me. I leaned back in my chair, the silence of the room heavy, but inside me there was no longer despair. There was power. A kind of power I had forgotten I still possessed. My decision was sealed. I would walk into the lawyer's office, and with the stroke of a pen, I would do what my son never believed I could. I would take back everything I had given him, and when it was over, I would leave. I would disappear. He would search for me, call for me, perhaps even beg, but he would never find me. Just as he had left me abandoned on that highway, I would abandon him in the ruins of the life he thought he controlled. I decided he would learn the truth. When you call your father worthless, you gamble with your entire world. And he was about to lose. The next morning, I woke before the sun rose. My body still ached from the highway, but my spirit carried a strange calm, like the silence before a storm that no one sees coming. My son had tossed me out of his car like garbage, but today would be different. Today, I would show him that garbage can burn down an entire house if ignored long enough. I dressed slowly, buttoning the same shirt I had worn the night before, and slipped the folder of documents into a worn leather bag. My steps were heavy, but they were steady. For years, I had walked into banks and offices for the sake of building his future. Now, I was walking into them to destroy it. I arrived at my lawyer's office just as the doors opened. He looked at me with surprise, concern flickering in his eyes at the sight of my bruised face and stiff movements. But I waved away his questions. I didn't come for sympathy. I came for results. I placed the folder on his desk, every paper neatly stacked, every signature already prepared for the moves I had decided on. He flipped through them slowly, reading, checking, cross-referencing. Then he looked up at me and in his calm, professional tone asked, "Are you certain you want to do this?" I stared at him, my voice steady, almost cold. "Yes." My son left me on the side of the highway like I was nothing. Now he will know what nothing feels like. There was no hesitation in me. The decision had already been made in my heart the night before. Today was simply about carrying it out. First came the accounts. My lawyer guided me to the bank, where I withdrew control over every dollar connected to my name. Years of savings, pensions, investments, all of it shifted into private accounts, untouchable by my son's greedy hands. With each signature, I felt as though I was reclaiming pieces of myself that he had stolen with his cruelty. The bank clerks moved quickly, papers shuffled, stamps pressed, and in less than an hour, his lifeline was gone. The accounts he thought he could rely on, the money he believed he had access to, had all vanished into my control. Then came the house. The very house I had worked decades to pay for. The house he lived in, as though it were his by right. I told my lawyer to put it on the market immediately. No hesitation, no delay. Legal transfer forms were signed, ownership reassigned, and within days, buyers were already circling. It didn't matter to me who bought it. A stranger, a family, anyone. What mattered was that my son would come home one day and find the walls he once called his sanctuary filled with boxes, movers, and unfamiliar faces. The roof he mocked me under would no longer shelter him. Each step of the process was like driving a nail into the coffin of his arrogance. I wasn't loud. I didn't shout or curse his name. My revenge was silent, methodical, carried out with the kind of patience only a father who had endured decades of sacrifice could possess. He had used his hands to throw me into the dirt. I used my pen to strip him of everything he thought he owned. And the irony was almost poetic. The very man he believed powerless was the man who had the legal power to end his comfort in a matter of days. I remembered his words from the highway. "You're nothing to me." As I signed the last paper, I whispered to myself, "And now, you are nothing to the world." It wasn't anger anymore. It was justice. Cold, sharp, undeniable justice. The lawyer nodded at me as the documents were sealed, his expression respectful, perhaps even impressed. He had seen many clients come in seeking revenge, but this was different. This was not about greed. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the worth that my son had tried to bury on the side of a highway. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter than I had in years. The pain in my body was still there, but my steps no longer dragged. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing taller than my son. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to strike back with fists. The world had given me a weapon far more powerful, the ability to erase his comfort with nothing but a stroke of ink. That day, as the sun began to set, I sat quietly by myself, sipping a cup of tea, knowing that somewhere my son was laughing, smug in the belief that he had broken me forever. But he had no idea that his downfall had already begun. By the time he realized, it would be far too late. His house would no longer be his. His money would be gone. His pride would be shredded in front of neighbors and relatives. And when he finally tried to call me, to scream at me, to demand answers, he would find nothing but silence. Because that was my revenge. Silent, final, absolute. The day of reckoning came sooner than I expected. My son, smug as ever, came home after one of his nights out. Music blaring from the car I once paid for, his laughter filling the street like he had conquered the world. He had no idea that the world he thought he controlled had already crumbled beneath his feet. When he pulled into the driveway, he noticed something odd. A moving truck parked at the curb, strangers carrying boxes through the front door. At first he thought it must be a mistake, perhaps a delivery or a neighbor's car parked too close. But when he stepped out and stormed up to the house, the lock clicked against his key. It didn't fit. It didn't belong to him anymore. Confusion turned to anger quickly. He pounded on the door, shouting, demanding entry, his voice echoing across the street. The new owners opened the door cautiously, papers in hand, their expressions cold. They told him the truth in simple words. The house was sold, legally, cleanly, completely. The deed no longer carried his name. Only mine, and now theirs. His arrogance cracked in that instant. The roof he had slept under, the walls he had mocked me within, the home he believed untouchable had slipped through his fingers overnight. And as the door shut in his face, the realization settled over him. He was homeless. But that was only the beginning. When he rushed to the bank the next morning, hoping to pull out cash, his panic only grew. He swiped his card, entered his code, and the machine spat out the same answer again and again. Insufficient funds. He stormed inside, his face red, demanding answers from the tellers. They checked the accounts, typed on their computers, and finally told him the truth he refused to believe. The balances were gone. Every account he thought he controlled had been emptied, every dollar moved beyond his reach. His lifeline had been severed, and the man he called worthless had cut it himself. He screamed, cursed, his voice carrying through the bank lobby, but no one rushed to his aid. People only stared. Some whispered. And in that silence, the weight of his humiliation grew heavier. He had mocked me, thrown me away, and now he stood exposed in front of strangers, powerless, red-faced, and broke. The whispers followed him out of the building, and they did not stop. Relatives began to hear the story. Neighbors began to talk. "Did you hear what he did to his father?" they whispered. "Threw him out on the highway. And now look, his house is gone, his money gone, his pride gone." The shame spread faster than fire, consuming the very reputation he had once tried to build. The man who had boasted of wealth, who strutted through the neighborhood as if he were a king, was now reduced to a beggar in his own story. I imagined him pacing, desperate, searching for me, trying to call. And yes, he did call. The phone rang again and again, his number flashing across the screen. But I never answered. Each time, I let it ring. The silence on my end louder than any words I could have spoken, because that silence was his true punishment. He had spoken his cruelty aloud when he spat on me, shoved me, left me on the roadside. My revenge was spoken in silence, the kind that leaves a man screaming into the void with no one to hear him. At night, I pictured him alone, sitting in the shell of the car I had once bought him, the only possession he had left, his head in his hands. The house gone, the accounts drained, the respect of the family shattered. And still, he did not understand that this was not sudden, not random, not fate. This was the consequence of his own actions. He had sown cruelty, and now he was choking on the harvest of it. The fallout was not just financial. It was social. Friends stopped visiting. Relatives stopped inviting him. Even the ones who once defended him now shook their heads, ashamed to be associated with the man who had thrown his father onto the highway. His arrogance had been built on the illusion of wealth and control, and now that illusion was gone. There was nothing left for others to admire. He was just another man stripped bare by his own cruelty. And in that fallout, I found peace. Because revenge is not always about watching someone suffer physically. It is about stripping away the false pride they wear like armor, until they stand naked before the world, exposed for who they truly are. My son had called me nothing. But now, in the eyes of everyone around him, he was the nothing. And I did not need to lift a hand or raise my voice to make it happen. I had let the papers, the signatures, and the silence do all the work. The aftermath of my decision spread like ripples in a pond, starting small, then widening until it touched every corner of my son's life. At first, he thought it was just a nightmare, something he could wake up from, something he could fix with a few angry phone calls or a desperate plea. But reality hit harder than any words I could have spoken. His house was no longer his. His bank accounts were dry, nothing but numbers that mocked him with zeros. His relatives no longer answered his calls. And when he walked through the neighborhood, he once strutted across with arrogance. People turned their heads away, unwilling to meet the eyes of a man who had thrown his father onto the highway. The shame clung to him like a shadow he could not escape. Neighbors began to whisper in corners. Old friends avoided him in public places. Even the grocer at the shop down the street, who once greeted him warmly, now served him coldly. No smile, no kindness, just the bare minimum. He tried to shout, to defend himself, but lies crumble quickly when the truth is already on everyone's lips. And the truth was simple. He betrayed his father. He left me bleeding on the side of a road, and the world knew it. The same arrogance he once wore like a crown now marked him as a villain. I imagined him at night, pacing the floor of some rented room, too small, too plain, nothing like the house he once called his palace. He would sit with his head in his hands, replaying his decisions, asking himself how everything had vanished so quickly. But I know the truth. It did not vanish quickly. It was years in the making. Every insult, every shove, every cruel word, every moment of disrespect led him here. The highway was just the last straw. The aftermath was not sudden collapse. It was the weight of his cruelty finally crashing down on him. His pride was gone. His friends abandoned him. Even his own family turned away. His wife left, unable to bear the shame of being tied to a man so disgraced. His children looked at him with confusion, asking why they no longer had a home, why people whispered when they passed, why their grandfather had disappeared. And he had no answers, only silence. Because how could he explain that his arrogance had destroyed everything? That the man he called worthless was the man who had the power to erase his world? For me, the aftermath was freedom. I no longer carried the burden of humiliation. I no longer waited for scraps of respect from a son who had none to give. I no longer sat at the table, quiet while insults cut into me. Instead, I lived in silence. But this silence was different. It was not the silence of pain. It was the silence of victory. The kind of silence that comes when justice has been served. I breathed deeply, and for the first time in years, I felt light. He tried to find me, of course. He called my number endlessly, left voicemails filled with anger, with begging, with curses, with apologies twisted by desperation. I listened to none of them. My silence was my final answer. He knocked on the doors of relatives, demanded to know where I was, but they shook their heads, some out of ignorance, some out of disgust. No one came to his rescue. The aftermath of cruelty is always loneliness, and he was learning that lesson in the hardest way possible. And while he sank deeper into disgrace, I began to rebuild my life in quiet strength. I found peace in places he could not reach, surrounded by dignity that could not be touched by betrayal. The money he thought was his became my tool for freedom. The house he thought belonged to him became a memory replaced by strangers' laughter. And the name he thought he had tarnished stood taller than ever, because the truth always outlives the lie. The aftermath was not just his ruin. It was my rebirth. I was no longer the old man on the side of the highway. I was the man who had taken back control of his life, who had turned humiliation into justice. And as my son sat in the ruins of his arrogance, I walked forward into a life where his cruelty no longer defined me. Justice, for me, did not come in the form of anger, shouting, or fists. It did not come in the way of revenge stories you hear about in movies or novels. My justice came in silence, in calm steps, in the quiet but unstoppable power of taking back what was mine. My son believed that by leaving me on the side of the highway, by shoving me into the dirt, he had ended my dignity forever. But the truth is, that night became the beginning of his downfall and the rebirth of my pride. He took away my peace for a moment, but I took away his entire world for the rest of his life. As I look back now, far away from the streets he still wanders, I feel no regret. The house he thought was his stands with new owners, laughter from strangers echoing off its walls, while he passes by with bitterness etched on his face. The bank accounts he once depended on are gone, drained into places he will never touch. The friends who once listened to his arrogant boasts now cross the street to avoid him, and the family he built on lies and pride looks at him with shame. He is surrounded by the emptiness he once wished upon me. That is justice. Not by my fists, not by my voice, but by my silence. For me, justice was not about making him starve or leaving him without shelter. Justice was about showing him the truth. The man he called worthless was the man who gave him everything, and the same man who could take it all back. And I did. I stood on the side of the highway with blood on my palms, and I thought I was powerless. But I walked into the lawyer's office with the same hands, and those hands rewrote everything. The pen was my weapon, the paper my battlefield, and my silence the victory song. I sometimes wonder if he still remembers that night, the way I do. The sound of the car door slamming shut, the gravel under my knees, the headlights fading as he drove away. I remember every detail, not with pain anymore, but with clarity. Because that was the night I stopped being a victim and became the judge of my own life. That was the night I chose to stop begging for respect and start reclaiming my dignity. That was the night justice began to take shape. Now, I live far away, in a place where his shadow cannot reach me. The air feels lighter here. My mornings are not filled with insults or humiliation, but with peace. I eat my meals at a table where I am not mocked, where no one spits cruelty into my face. I sleep without fear of being thrown out, without the weight of waiting for another insult. And most importantly, I live knowing that my silence was stronger than his violence. My justice was not loud, but it was absolute. My son, on the other hand, is left with nothing but the ruins of his arrogance. He walks through life carrying the shame of what he did, the whispers of neighbors, the disappointment of relatives, and the knowledge that his downfall came not from enemies, but from his own father, the man he betrayed. He will spend the rest of his life remembering the day he shoved me onto that highway, and the day after, when everything he thought was his slipped through his fingers. That memory will never leave him. That memory is his punishment, his prison, his chain. And so, my justice is complete. He called me worthless, and now the world calls him nothing. He left me bleeding on the highway, and I left him begging on the streets. He thought he had taken away my power, but I showed him that true power comes from the one who built everything, not the one who inherited it. And in the end, I built his downfall just as carefully as I once built his life. Final thought. He threw me out on the highway. The next day, I sold his house and left him begging. Before I end, let me tell you, I don't know how much time I have left in this world before I go back to God. That's why I made the Balance and Fall Prevention Guide only for you, so you can stay steady, safe, and independent. Download it now. The link is in the description.